In my hospital room, my sister pulled my monitor cord and said, "You always fake being sick." But the nurse outside heard everything. She walked in and said, "You're not leaving, I called the police." My sister turned white. My mom begged, but 10 minutes later. I wasn't even awake when the screaming started. It was my sister's voice, high and sharp, echoing down the hallway before I could fully open my eyes. My whole body felt like it had been filled with wet sand. My eyes were dry, my head ached, and my chest was tight under the weight of 1,000 unspoken things. I couldn't remember if it was morning or evening. The fluorescent lights in the room didn't help. The last thing I clearly remembered was the crunch of metal, the way my car spun after being hit, and a man's voice yelling that help was coming. Then a blur of sirens, lights, and sharp voices. Now here I was in a hospital bed, for in my arm, one leg in a brace, a bruise blooming across my ribs. And the first thing I heard after waking was Tessa shouting something about parking validation. They walked in like they had somewhere more important to be. My mom went straight to the chair by the window, flipping through her phone. Tessa stood at the edge of my bed like she was inspecting me for damage she didn't believe was real. I didn't say anything. I wasn't even sure I could speak yet. My throat felt like it had been scrubbed raw. Tessa glanced at the machines, then at me. "So dramatic. You totaled your car for what? A few cracked ribs and a sprain? That thing was junk anyway." She smiled like she'd made a clever joke. My mom chuckled, not even looking up. I stayed still. Let them talk. They'd get bored eventually. They always did. She leaned over and touched the heart monitor cord. "This beeping's annoying. Honestly, you always fake being sick. You've been like this since we were kids." And she yanked it out. The screen went dark. The flatline sound didn't even have time to ring out, just silence. I didn't move. I was too tired to argue, too sick to defend myself. I remember wondering if this was how people lost their minds, quietly when no one believed them. What none of us noticed was that the door to the room hadn't fully closed. The nurse had been standing just outside, chart in hand. She stepped in, calm but with a look that made even my mother pause. "You're not leaving. I've called the police." Tessa went pale like she'd been doused in cold water. My mom's mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. Then came the excuses. She didn't mean anything by it. "We were just talking. He was just upset. It's been a stressful week." The nurse didn't care. She reconnected the monitor, checked the 4-line, and didn't say another word to them. Security was already on the way. I could hear the buzz of the nurse's station outside, more voices, footsteps moving fast. Tessa started pacing. "You're making this into a thing. We didn't do anything wrong. She's fine. Look at her." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My chest felt like it was caving in. Whether from the accident or from being in the same room as them, I didn't know. 10 minutes later, 2 police officers walked in. One male, one female. They looked at the nurse first, then at me. My mom tried to intercept, but the female officer gently moved her aside. They asked me if I felt safe. I didn't answer. That was enough. They told Tessa and my mom they were being detained for interfering with medical equipment and threatening a patient under hospital care. I watched both of them stumble over their words, deny everything, blame each other, and finally go silent as they were escorted out. The door shut again, this time with a click. I was alone, but for the first time since the crash, I didn't feel like I was the problem. They walked out of the room surrounded by security and 2 officers. My mom's voice kept trying to catch up with them, throwing out explanations, lies, little manipulations dressed as concern, but no one was listening anymore. The nurse gave them a final glance like she'd already written them off. The door clicked shut behind them, and for the first time in hours I was able to breathe without someone hovering over me, judging me for it. But the relief didn't last. The doctor came in about half an hour later. Not the ER resident who stitched me up. This one was higher up, more senior, and clearly more involved than I expected. Her name tag read Dr. Khanna. She was calm, serious, and definitely not someone you could talk circles around. She looked me over and asked if I was in pain. I told her I was fine, mostly because I was too drained to say anything else. She sat down. Then she told me something I hadn't expected at all. Apparently, this wasn't the first time my sister had been flagged for inappropriate behavior in the hospital. While I'd been unconscious, Tessa had already tried to access my chart by claiming she was my primary emergency contact. She was denied, but came back an hour later and tried again with a different nurse. Same result. Then she started saying I was faking everything. She told a nurse I had a long history of attention-seeking behavior, and tried to convince them to take me off pain medication. And my mom? She was recorded on hospital cameras multiple times, rolling her eyes, making faces behind the nurses' backs, mocking the way I was breathing. All of it was documented, witnessed, reported. I didn't even know how to react. Dr. Khanna asked if I wanted to file a formal complaint, and I just sat there staring at the wall. I wasn't angry, I was something deeper than that. Something colder. Like a part of me was finally giving up on pretending these people loved me the way a family should. That night, I was moved to a quieter floor, away from the general ward into a smaller room near the end of the hall. A nurse told me it was standard for patients recovering from trauma. But I knew better. It was protection. Because the hospital didn't trust my family. Neither did I. The next morning I finally got my phone back. It had been in a plastic bag with my wallet and watch. The battery was nearly dead, but when it turned on, it lit up like Vegas. 32 missed calls. 17 voicemails. My sister had texted me 6 times in a row at 3 a.m., saying everything from, "I can't believe you let them arrest us," to "call me now before this gets worse." Worse. It was just getting started. By noon my Aunt Lorna called me crying. She'd heard about everything, sort of. My mom had called her and said I'd set them up to get arrested. That I was making a scene in the hospital and ruining the family's name. I told her the truth. Not even all of it. Just the part about the unplugged monitor, the nurse, and what the doctor said. That was enough. By the end of the day, word had spread through our family chat. My cousin Rachel sent me screenshots. People were choosing sides. A few relatives said I was doing too much. Others finally admitted they'd seen Tessa act like this for years and were just too polite to say anything. That part hurt more than I thought it would. I was discharged 2 days later, still sore, still stiff, but stable enough to go home. I didn't tell anyone which day I was leaving, but they found out anyway. As the nurse wheeled me to the entrance, I saw them waiting outside. Tessa was leaning on the railing looking at her phone. My mom was holding a grocery bag with flowers and one of those cheap balloons that said "Get well soon." She smiled like nothing had happened. "You just want to talk." We didn't mean for it to get so far. I didn't respond. I didn't take the flowers. I didn't even slow down. They followed me all the way to the parking lot, my mom half running behind the wheelchair, saying I was overreacting, that I was making a private issue public, that I was punishing them for one misunderstanding. I said nothing, but I saw the look on the nurse's face who had wheeled me out, like she'd seen this before. Like she knew exactly what kind of family dynamic this was. They didn't follow me into the car. But the damage was already done. What came next was worse. I didn't unpack for 2 days. The suitcase sat in the hallway like a reminder that I didn't really feel home, not anymore. I kept moving from room to room, locking the windows, checking the deadbolt on the front door, turning the porch light on even during the day. Every car that passed made me tense up. Every silence felt like it was holding its breath. It wasn't paranoia. It was experience. The first sign came in the form of a voicemail. My landlord, Steve, said someone had called asking about a few updates to my lease agreement. He didn't think much of it at the time, until the woman on the phone started pushing for a copy of my key. When he asked for ID verification, she hung up. I asked if she gave a name. She didn't. But she said she was my sister. I didn't even have to ask which one. I called my bank next, then the second one, then the credit union I barely used but still had an account with. I had set that one up years ago when my mom had hip surgery and I needed a shared account to cover some of her hospital expenses. At the time it felt practical. But responsible. Now it felt like a trap I built myself. The joint account balance had dropped dramatically in just a week. Down to $826.48. It had been over $10,000 when I last checked, maybe 3 months ago. I stared at the screen, rereading the numbers, refreshing the page as if that would change it. There were transfers. Withdrawals. 2 of them for $3,000, spaced just far enough apart to avoid triggering a fraud flag. I didn't even bother calling her. I closed the account immediately and started pulling my name from everything I could think of. And then I did something I should have done a long time ago. I bought cameras. One for the front porch. One for the side door. One inside the living room. I didn't want to be that person paranoid in her own home, but I also didn't want to be the woman on the news who didn't see it coming. The technician came the next day. He was nice. Asked if I'd had break-ins before. I didn't answer. But I told him to make sure the system uploaded everything to the cloud. That night I finally slept for more than 4 hours. The kind of heavy sleep that makes you forget where you are for a moment. Until the banging started. It was a deep thud, not like a knock. More like a shoulder hitting the door. Then came the yelling. Open the door. No. I didn't move. I stayed frozen behind the couch, my phone in my hand, already dialing 911. The voice was unmistakable. Tess. My mother's was there too, more controlled but saying the same thing. Let's not make this worse. Let's talk like adults. You owe us that. I didn't respond. I already knew where this was going. The operator told me to stay inside, not engage, and wait. I could hear my mother shouting something about lawyers and filing for power of attorney. Then a loud crash. They threw something at the door. I watched the live feed on my phone from the porch camera. Tessa was holding a brick. The police arrived fast. Not sirens blazing fast, but fast enough. One officer walked up the driveway and they both tried to act casual like they were just checking on me. They were told to leave. The officer didn't ask questions, just stood between them and the door, waiting until they backed off. But they didn't go far. They sat in the car parked across the street for over an hour. Just watching. That's when I called my Uncle Alan and my Aunt Lorna. Told them everything. Not just the incident. The bank account. The landlord. The threats. The screaming. The look on Tessa's face when she held that brick like she wasn't just thinking about the door. They drove over that night and didn't even hesitate to bring overnight bags. My aunt went straight to the kitchen and started making tea like she lived there. My uncle didn't ask questions. He just checked the locks and said he'd stay up for a while. But the next morning brought a new low. I walked into the kitchen to make coffee and found the cabinet door hanging off its hinge. Every dish inside shattered on the floor. It wasn't an accident. The window above the sink had been forced open just a crack. Enough for a hand. Or a tool. That's when I realized they weren't just trying to scare me. They wanted me to feel unsafe. Unstable. Outnumbered. And honestly, it was working. I used to think people like my mom and sister only caused emotional damage. Manipulation, gaslighting, shame. That kind of thing. But now it felt like I was uncovering a plan, one slow, terrifying layer at a time. The broken dishes were just the start. That morning, while my aunt swept up the mess and my uncle inspected the back window for signs of forced entry, I got an email from my life insurance provider. Subject line: confirmation of beneficiary change. I froze. I hadn't updated anything. I hadn't even logged into that account since the pandemic. I opened the email and immediately felt sick. Someone had submitted a request to remove my primary beneficiary, me, and replace it with my mother. The change hadn't gone through because the digital signature didn't match. But the fact that they had my policy number and enough personal information to try? That chilled me more than anything else had. I showed my aunt first. She read the email in silence, handed it to my uncle, and then asked me something I hadn't considered. Did you ever tell them about this policy? I had. Once. 2 years ago. It came up during a dinner conversation, something about being prepared. My mom had made a snide comment about how I'd probably outlive everyone anyway, and Tessa had joked, well, if you die, I hope I get the car. They remembered. Qley. My uncle's reaction changed after that. He got on the phone with a lawyer he knew through his logistics company. He didn't even tell me what he was doing, just handed me the phone when the lawyer was ready to talk. The questions came fast. Had I already filed a police report? Did they have access to my financials? Were they ever listed as medical proxies? Did the hospital document the monitor incident? I told him everything. Then he asked something I hadn't expected. Had they asked about end-of-life decisions while I was unconscious? That part one didn't know. But I did remember what the doctor told me. The nurses had reported that both my mom and Tessa tried to get involved in my treatment. Tried to reduce pain meds. Tried to imply I was faking symptoms. Tried to gain access to records. The lawyer told me flat out. This wasn't just emotional abuse anymore. This was a pattern that looked dangerously close to something criminal. And the worst part? I'd left the door open for years. I'd given them access to one of my old accounts when I was helping pay off my mom's medical bills. That joint account had almost $11,000 in it. It had $826 left. The bank couldn't reverse the transfers. They were done in legal intervals, nothing suspicious to the fraud department. But what really broke me was the last note the bank had on file. Someone had come in person days after my accident to ask about account closure forms. They didn't have ID, so the teller denied them. But they gave a name. Tessa. I closed every account that day. Transferred everything to a new bank. Changed my locks again. My uncle installed extra deadbolts and window bars. My aunt texted my cousins and told them to stay alert. If my mother or sister showed up asking questions, they weren't to be told anything. That night, after we finally sat down for dinner, my phone buzzed again. But this time it wasn't an email. It was a security alert. Motion detected on the front porch camera at 12:17 a.m. I opened the app and saw him. Not my mother. Not my sister. A man I didn't recognize. Hoodie, jeans, standing just out of the direct frame, phone to his ear, pacing slowly in front of my door like he was waiting for someone to answer. Then he looked directly at the door and said my name. Not shouting. Come. Like he knew me. Like he expected me to open it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. He stood there for exactly 2 more minutes, then walked back to a car I didn't recognize, got in and drove off. My uncle called the police again and sent the footage. We never got a name. But 2 days later my cousin Rachel texted me with something that made my blood run cold. Tessa had posted a vague update on her social media. People who betray family don't realize how replaceable they are. After that man showed up on my porch, something inside me went completely still. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just watched the security footage on loop until my aunt walked in and asked why I hadn't gone to sleep. When I showed her the video, she didn't even ask who he was. She just stared for a long time, then said we should have stopped them years ago. By morning, my uncle had already sent the footage to the police and flagged it with the lawyer handling the restraining order. I gave a short written statement, confirming I didn't know the man, didn't expect anyone, and hadn't given out my address to anyone outside of close family. They told me to keep my doors locked and not engage if he returned. That didn't feel like much of a plan, but my uncle had one. He called a meeting. Not with the people causing chaos, but with the people who mattered. 3 of his siblings, 2 cousins, 1 business partner. All of them had been watching things unfold from a distance, getting the bits and pieces through texts and awkward family calls. But this time he laid everything out. The hospital report. The attempt to change my insurance beneficiary. The bank withdrawals from the joint account I had stupidly left open. The midnight visit from a stranger who knew my name. And the police reports tying all of it together. What shocked me wasn't that my uncle had kept records. It was that he wasn't the only one. My cousin Abby said she'd been contacted by my mom a few days ago, asking if she knew how much I might have inherited from our grandfather. There was no inheritance, just assumptions. She asked if that man was sent to scare me. I said I didn't know, but that he looked calm. Too calm. That was the moment everything broke open. My uncle made some calls and started the process to remove both my mother and Tessa from the family business account, an LLC they had no real role in but still got dividends from. He also froze the small trust our grandfather had left for family emergencies, which until now, they'd both occasionally dipped into using guilt and stories about needing help. He told me to stop worrying, that it was all being handled, but I knew better. Because that night around 8:45 they showed up again. No warning. No phone call. No apology. They came to the door yelling like they were the ones who'd been wronged. My mom had a folder in her hand. She waved it like it proved something. Tessa barged in behind her before anyone could block the door. They didn't want to talk. They wanted control. My mom accused me of poisoning the family. Of exaggerating everything. She said I'd destroyed their reputations. Tessa knocked over a lamp. Said I was turning everyone against them just to play the victim. When my aunt told them to leave, my mom looked at her and said, "You're just trying to take her money too." That was when my uncle stepped in. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just said loud enough for everyone to hear, "If you speak one more word, I'll have you both cut out of every remaining contract, every asset, every dollar tied to this family." My mom froze. Tessa started to say something, but my uncle raised a finger and said, "No more. We're done protecting you from yourselves." Then he looked at me and asked one question. "Do you want them here?" I said no. And for the first time in my life, someone actually listened. They were told to leave now, or the police would be called again. My aunt stood between me and the door until they finally backed out. No screaming. No crying. Just 2 people who finally realized the one thing they really cared about, access, was gone. That night I stayed on the couch while my aunt made tea and my uncle changed the locks again, even though they'd never had keys. I stared out the window for a long time, not because I thought they'd come back but because I finally believed they might not. But the fear didn't leave. I felt safe, yes, but only in this tiny window. This one house. This one moment. I knew the rest of the world was still too close. The next morning I started looking up apartments in other cities. Quiet ones. Small ones. Places where no one would look for me. And I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. When I left, I didn't tell anyone but my aunt and uncle. No dramatic post online. No group text explaining anything. I just disappeared. Early morning. 1 suitcase. Everything else donated or left behind. My uncle drove ahead with a rented trailer carrying the few pieces of furniture we bought secondhand. My aunt followed in her car with snacks, blankets, and a thermos of coffee like we were going on a casual road trip. We weren't. It felt more like an escape plan. In some ways it was. The apartment was 2 hours away, small, older, and not in any place my family had reason to visit. It wasn't cute. It wasn't trendy. But it had a bolt lock that worked and neighbors who didn't ask questions. That was enough. The first few nights I couldn't sleep. Not because of noise but because it was too quiet. No sirens. No arguing voices bleeding through the walls. No unexpected knocks on the door. Just stillness. I kept my phone on silent, face down, like I was waiting for something bad to happen. Nothing did. I started going for walks around the block just to remind myself I wasn't hiding. I'd pass strangers and wonder if they could tell I was someone who'd lost more than she let on. Maybe they did. Maybe that's why they never stopped to ask. I bought a second-hand table, 2 chairs, and a couch that squeaked when you sat down. My uncle helped drill blackout curtains into the wall. My aunt stocked my pantry like I was moving into a college dorm. I kept thinking they'd slowly pull back, visit less, fade out once they felt like I was stable. They didn't. They drove up almost every weekend. Sometimes for a few hours. Sometimes just to drop off groceries or see if I needed anything. They never pushed. They never asked how I was coping. They just showed up. That, more than anything else, made me feel like maybe not all family was broken. The restraining order stayed in place. No violations. No weird calls. No unknown cars parked outside. It was quiet in the way I'd always wanted it to be but never believed was real. The kind of quiet that makes you realize how much noise you were raised to accept as normal. Tessa and my mother never tried to contact me again. But that didn't mean they disappeared. I heard from Abby once, through a burner number. All she said was, "You were right. I didn't want to see it before. I do now." I didn't reply. Not out of anger. Just because I was done giving pieces of myself away. The money was gone. I accepted that. They drained it. What they couldn't take they tried to scare me out of. And when that failed they moved on. Probably to some new story they'd spin to anyone who would listen. I stopped caring about what version of me they fed to other people. What mattered was that they didn't know where I was anymore. Not where I lived. Not who I worked for. Not who I was becoming. I worked remotely. Nothing glamorous. Just stable. And quiet. I saved more. Cooked more. Sat with myself more than I ever had. Some days were still heavy. I'd open the fridge and stare at a dish my aunt made and suddenly remember the way my mom used to scream at me for being selfish any time I wanted something different than she did. But those moments passed. They always passed. The loneliness came in waves. That part didn't surprise me. When you leave people who've hurt you your whole life, you don't just feel free. You also feel empty for a while. You grieve something that never really existed. That's the part no one prepares you for. But eventually the silence started to feel safe. One weekend my aunt and I sat out on the tiny balcony drinking tea. She looked out over the parking lot and asked if I was happy. I didn't answer right away. I didn't know if I was, not yet. But I told her I felt like myself for the first time in a very long time. And that was enough.